Okay, good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for those of you that saw the weather and came early, those of you that braved the rain and got here. Thank you to all of you. This is such a wonderful turnout. It's so lovely to see all of you. Welcome to the Menil. I am Kelly Montana. I'm the assistant curator at the Menil Institute, which is the building we are in, and the curator of the exhibition Lewen, The Parade, that occasions our gathering with Dr. Joshua Furman this evening. Tonight, we are co-presenting this program with Rice University's Boniuk Institute for the study and advancement of religious tolerance, and I'm thrilled to have you all with us. Before I begin, I'd like to remind everyone to silence your cell phones, please. We are recording this talk, and it will be posted online in the coming weeks. For those of you that haven't viewed our exhibition yet, the artist Lewen was a Polish Jewish refugee to the United States. He grew up in Germany, where he observed the political and cultural upheaval happening around him. In 1933, when Hitler came to power, he fled to France with his brother and later immigrated to the United States. After enlisting in the U.S. Army and joining an elite unit of German-speaking special forces called the Ritchie Boys, he saw action in Normandy and visited the Buchenwald concentration camp shortly after its liberation in 1945. The artist was devastated by the atrocities of the Holocaust, and it informed his artwork for the entirety of his life. The drawings that form Lewen's story, The Parade, speak to the cyclical nature of war and violence, a message as potent today as it was in 1957 when the book was published. His tale is a haunting one, grounded in personal episodes in his life and the history he witnessed, while also evoking a prismatic lens on atrocity across time and place. Lewen's observation that cycles of violent rhetoric and militarism produce excitement and pride before giving way to terror and destruction. It is a sentiment that was not far from the minds of the founders of the Menil collection, Joan and Boniuk de Menil. From their philanthropic vision to their work with artists, they sought to combat prejudice and champion social justice. It is this worldview where the core message of this exhibition dovetails with the important work of the Boniuk Institute. To share more about the Institute in tonight's program, I would like to welcome Elaine Howard-Eklund, Director of the Institute, to the podium.
Thank you so much, Kelly, and thank you to the Menil. It's just such an incredible, incredible privilege to be here tonight. For those of you who don't know me, I'm a professor of sociology at Rice University and also have the privilege of directing the Boniuk Institute for the study and advancement of religious tolerance at Rice. Let me just briefly introduce you to the work of the Boniuk Institute. Our mission is to understand and combat religious violence and discrimination, and to foster a robust religious pluralism and tolerance through research as well as extensive public outreach. The partnership with Menil is such a special opportunity to harness the power of art as a universal language for sharing the message of tolerance with the aim of ending religious violence. After the lecture, I encourage you to visit the exhibit and spend some time with Lewen's work. And on behalf of the Boniuk Institute, it's a privilege to be one of the many sponsors of this very important exhibit. I also want to acknowledge the Boniuk family, who I just saw walk in, which is really wonderful, who braved the weather to be here, especially Dr. Milton Boniuk, Lori Boniuk, and Deborah Boniuk, who I believe are all here tonight. Although tonight we are looking at Houston specifically from a historical lens, as we all know, we could also be addressing numerous examples of anti-Semitism and anti-Jewish violence, which are occurring in increased numbers, both in the U.S. and around the world. These localized events speak to a wider movement where we can see evidence on mainstream social media platforms such as Twitter and other high-profile individuals who've been allowed to spread anti-Semitism of late. I should note that studying anti-Semitism and other forms of religious discrimination has been a focus of the Boniuk Institute and its program, the Religion and Public Life program. From 2018 to 2020, we led a study funded by the National Science Foundation on experiences of religious discrimination. And it's no surprise probably to those gathered here that we found that over 1/3 of Jewish individuals that we've surveyed reported experiencing hostility and extreme disrespect towards their religion when interacting with other people. Tonight's presentation will explore how Jewish Houstonians have experienced discrimination and exclusion with a focus on neighborhood social spaces and occupations. Using materials from the Joan and Stanford Alexander Jewish Archives at Rice University, we will examine instances of anti-Semitism from the 20th century to the present. We will conclude with a discussion of the ways in which Houston's Jewish community has been involved and even leading interfaith efforts to combat all forms of prejudice and create a more open and welcoming city for all Houstonians. I'm now honored to introduce you to tonight's speaker, my friend and colleague, Dr. Joshua Furman. Dr. Furman is the founder and curator of the Houston Jewish History Archive at Rice University, where he also serves as associate director and lecturer in the program in Jewish Studies. At Rice, Dr. Furman offers courses on immigration history, American Judaism, Black Jewish relations, and even Jewish food. His most recent publication is a chapter about Jewish Houston in the book Making Houston Modern, The Life and Architecture of Howard Barnstone, which was published in 2020 by the University of Texas Press, if you want to do other reading after tonight. He's also authored an essay on migration in American Jewish history for the volume Interpreting American Jewish History at Museums and Historic Sites. His article about Jewish immigration into Texas via the Galveston movement will appear in the 2022 issue of the Southern Jewish History Journal. And I know from personal experiences that Dr. Furman is both a prolific scholar, but also a champion of supporting students at Rice University and doing all he can to reach out to the broader community of Houston and beyond. We're just so proud to have him as a colleague at Rice and in leadership of the Jewish Studies program. Dr. Furman received his PhD in modern Jewish history from the University of Maryland in 2015. And at this point, I want to again thank you for being part of this very important event. And as Kelly said, for braving the weather. And I will now hand it over to Dr. Furman. Thank you again.
Okay, everybody, good evening, welcome. Such an honor to be here. I want to thank Elaine and Kate and the staff at the Menil for organizing tonight's program. Such a wonderful opportunity. And it's a beautiful evening out. Would you look at that? We could have class outside after all. So the topic of my remarks tonight is anti-Semitism in the archive, and I've subtitled it Documenting Prejudice in Texas Jewish History. And the vision of what I'm going to speak about has veered slightly from what Professor Eklund has promised you, but I do think it'll provide us with some helpful context for understanding Cy Lewen's work and for finding continuities between what took place in Europe some generations ago and what's unfortunately unfolding in our society today. Before I get to that topic, I want to speak just briefly about my work at Rice. So I am the curator of something called the Joan and Stanford Alexander South Texas Jewish Archives. And our mission is to collect, preserve, and make accessible the documents, photographs, artifacts, and memories that tell the story of Jewish life both in Greater Houston and now across South Texas, but not just to collect these materials and lock them away in a secret vault, but to make them accessible to the public, to researchers, to community members, and really to use them as a helpful tool for understanding the history of our community. This is a project that was established in 2018. Over the past 5 years, we've amassed nearly 200 physical collections and 50 oral histories, and tonight you'll get to hear some clips from one of those oral histories. And it's housed in the Woodson Research Center in Rice's Fondren Library, which If you've never seen it, and here's our website, which you hopefully can go and explore later on. This is our reading room. It's on the first floor of the library, and it's open to the public. You can come Monday through Friday, 9 a.m. to 4 p.m., and visit by appointment to see some of the collections I'll be speaking about tonight, as well as other collections that you may be interested in. Earlier this spring, I had the great honor of teaching a session about Judaism and American Jewish history for a group of Texas school teachers, and it was a program, a professional development program, I should say, organized by the Boniuk Institute at Rice. And so it's an opportunity for me to spend just an hour or so with teachers who are working to educate the next generation of citizens about the great religions of the world and of our society. And most of that talk that I gave was about American Jewish history and how Jews came to this country and why they did so. But as we neared the end of the talk, I turned my focus to anti-Semitism. And what I argued to that group is, as much as America has been a safe haven for Jews around the world, it's also true that since the colonial period, Jews have faced discrimination and exclusion in American life. And so when we look back at across the span of American Jewish history, there's much to be grateful for, Jewish Americans, but there are also these continual episodes, moments, examples of discrimination, exclusion, and even persecution, and we'll be talking about those this evening. You can see two examples on the screen here behind me. One is an anti-Jewish immigration cartoon from 1881 that was printed in Puck magazine, a popular magazine from that era. And then we'll be talking in a few minutes more about the Ku Klux Klan, and here is an anti-Jewish and anti-Catholic cartoon published by the Klan in the 1920s. But this, unfortunately, is not a phenomenon of 100 years ago or the distant past. Unfortunately, just in the last few years, we've witnessed a series of really troubling events. From the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville, Virginia in 2017, to the murder of 11 Jews at synagogue in Pittsburgh in October of 2018. We've also more recently been treated to a series of anti-Semitic comments from rapper Kanye West, who threatened on Twitter to go DEFCON, was it DEFCON 4? I can't remember which DEFCON it was, but Kanye threatened, made violent threatening remarks toward Jews on social media, and then Kyrie Irving, the NBA basketball player, promoted a film on social media that repeats anti-Semitic tropes about Jews, among other things, having controlled the slave trade. And that was just last year. I was actually in the middle of teaching a Black-Jewish relations course at Rice last year when these comments came to light, and it made for quite an interesting discussion with my students as to what was happening and why. And also, we've had episodes of hatred closer to home here in Texas. I am from San Antonio, and in October of 2021, there was a demonstration near the Holocaust Museum in San Antonio with a banner that says, "Honk if you know the Holocaust is fake." And we all, I'm sure, remember the terrible hostage situation that unfolded at Congregation Beth Israel in Colleyville, Texas, in January of 2022, and thank goodness nobody was harmed, but another truly frightening episode. And then just a few short months ago here in Houston, in the neighborhood of Riverside Terrace, which ironically was, as many of you I'm sure know, in the 1930s and 40s into the 50s, a Jewish enclave. Anti-Semitic flyers were distributed on people's lawns and driveways in the middle of the night, and a friend of mine who lives there took this picture of the material that was left for her to find when she woke up that morning. It's, for those of you who can't see, it's a flyer, and it reads, "Every single aspect of the media is Jewish." And this was one of a series of anti-Semitic flyers that were distributed in Riverside Terrace that day. The Anti-Defamation League, in its 2022 report on anti-Semitism, noted a 36% rise in incidents across America in 2022. Nearly 3,700 cases, ranging from vandalism to harassment to assault. That is an all-time high. I'm very sad to say a new record, and it's the third time in 5 years that a new record for these incidents has been reached. Deborah Lipstadt, who is a professor of history at Emory and has been a really important figure in combating Holocaust denial. There was a movie made about her. I'm still waiting for the movie to be made about me. Not going to happen, but in Professor Lipstadt's case, it is richly deserved. And she was appointed the U.S. Special Envoy for Monitoring and Combating Anti-Semitism. She published a book called Antisemitism Here and Now in 2019. And one of the arguments that she makes in this book is that, yes, empirical evidence is important. Statistics matter. But what we shouldn't do is get too hung up on the numbers, on the counting. Because ultimately, she argues, anti-Semitism is a worldview problem, not a statistical problem. And she writes, quote, "What should alarm us is that human beings continue to believe in a conspiracy that demonizes Jews and sees them as responsible for evil. The historical consequences of this nefarious passion have been so disastrous that to ignore its contemporary manifestations would be irresponsible." And then you might be wondering, well, why might those outside the Jewish community be concerned, right? Isn't this a problem that's unique to just a single group, and why should I care? And to that question, she writes, quote, "The existence of prejudice in any of its forms is a threat to all those who value an inclusive, democratic, and multicultural society. Anti-Semitism flourishes in a society that is intolerant of others, be they immigrants or racial and religious minorities. When expressions of contempt for one group become normative, it is virtually inevitable that similar hatred will be directed at other groups." So a society that has a problem with anti-Semitism, in other words, also will have problems with other forms of prejudice and discrimination and hate. So what I want to do tonight is look back using archival sources that we have in the collection at Rice and in other libraries and archives that I've consulted in doing the research for this talk to see what common threads emerge, what patterns, what motifs, what ideas do we hear, do we see repeating themselves over and over again in the longer history of anti-Semitism in the United States. And then, what can we do about it? What can we do about it? Not that we're going to solve anti-Semitism tonight, but if we walk out of here having listened to this presentation and having viewed the parade, maybe we'll walk out of here with some action ideas, some ideas of what we might feel compelled to do next. So the first thing I'm going to talk about tonight is the history of the Ku Klux Klan in Texas in its earlier period in the 1920s. And I want to recognize, being a historian and an archivist, the various sources that I consulted. And so this photo of a Klan initiation ceremony, which I believe took place in Bay City, because the photo says Bay City on it, came to us from the Fort Bend Museum, and I accessed it via the Portal to Texas History, which is a wonderful resource for doing historical research online. It's an open access database operated by the University of North Texas that we at Rice and Fondren Library have partnered with to share our archival resources with great success. So Wednesday, October 24th, 1923, was marked as Klan Day at the Texas State Fair in Dallas. And you can see here the graphic of the hooded knight with the slogan, "Yesterday, Today, and Forever." This was an event that obviously was open to the public. Thousands of people attended. There were fireworks. There was a concert, if you can believe it, competitive drills, and not something that happened in secret, in shadow, but very much out in the open. So let's just take a moment and cover some quick historical background about the Klan. So the history of the Klan can be roughly divided into 3 periods, and we'll be talking about the middle period tonight. But the origins of the group date to 1866 in Tennessee, so not long after the conclusion of the Civil War, when a group of Confederate veterans without much organization or fanfare began to violently terrorize blacks and Reconstruction supporters. The movement spread, but without organization and momentum, it had disbanded by the early 1870s. And then in 1915, something monumental happened. And the first thing that happened was, believe it or not, a movie. A movie that many of you, I'm sure, will have heard of, and a few of you may even have seen. I'm referring to D.W. Griffith's Birth of a Nation, a film that was screened in the White House. And it's, as you can see here in the movie poster, glorifies the original Klan and its quest to defend the sanctity and purity of white women and from the terror of, quote unquote, of black savagery. And from this movie came a groundswell of enthusiasm for reviving the Klan, this time reimagined as a secret society complete with rituals, oaths, ranks, and all of the trappings of a secret society with claverns and cleagraps and all kinds of utter ridiculousness, quite frankly. The other thing that took place in 1915 that we can't lose sight of is that a Jewish man named Leo Frank was accused of raping and murdering a white girl named Mary Fagan, who worked at the pencil factory that he managed. On flimsy evidence, he was tried and found guilty and incarcerated, and a mob with Klan connections broke into the jail, pulled Frank out, and proceeded to lynch him. And this was an event that obviously, as you can imagine, sent shockwaves across the country and particularly across the Jewish community. Unlike the earlier iteration of the Klan, that 1866 version that I spoke about a moment ago, this post-1915 version of the Klan targeted Jews and Catholics alongside blacks as enemies of what they called the American way of life. And at its 1924 peak, if we can believe their curated statistics, they claim to have some 4.5 million members in the United States, about 200,000 in Texas. There were people who ran for public office across the country who were open Klan sympathizers. It was, again, not anything that would disqualify you from holding public office in this country at that time. Because of their proximity to whiteness in Texas's racial hierarchy, Jews, for the most part, escaped the worst of the Texas Klan's notorious anger and violence, but at least in 2 cases, Jewish Texans were actually beaten and terrorized. Not killed, but one was tarred and feathered and another was brutally attacked. One for having a close relationship with a black person. So let's now meet Hiram Wesley Evans, who you can see was born in Alabama but grew up right here in Texas, educated at Vanderbilt. This is the part where I say something mean about Vanderbilt, but this is being recorded, so I won't do that. It's a fine institution, Hiram Wesley Evans notwithstanding. He practiced dentistry in Dallas and became active in the Klan in 1920 and quickly rose through the ranks, was a real go-getter, very ambitious, and he served in the highest office of imperial wizard from 1922 to 1939. And he was, as you can imagine, the keynote speaker that day at the Klan Day at the Texas State Fair in October of 1923. And here he is, by the way, on the cover of Time magazine just a year later. And here's what he had to say about Jews in his Klan Day speech. Jews constitute an absolutely unblendable element in American life. They are law-abiding, intelligent, and moral, but they lack true patriotic feeling for America, and they cling to their separate traditions. Sit with that for a minute. They are law-abiding, intelligent, and moral, but they lack true patriotic feeling for America, and they cling to their separate traditions. Quote, "Their homes are not American, but Jewish homes, into which we cannot go, and from which they will never emerge for a real intermingling with America." So what's wrong with Jews, says Hiram Wesley Evans, is not that they're bad people. They have some good qualities, but they're not real Americans, and they never will be by design. Another important voice for the Klan right here in our city of Houston, Texas, was this newspaper, Colonel Mayfield's Weekly, which you can access online thanks to the Briscoe Center for American History at UT Austin. This is a newspaper that frequently will criticize Catholics. As a matter of fact, you truly could argue that the main subject of ire in Colonel Mayfield's Weekly is Catholicism and Catholics. But here you can see a headline, it's the Ku Klux Klan versus Jew, Jug, and Jesuits. There's a real fondness for alliteration in this lead here. And here's what Colonel Mayfield's Weekly had to say about Jews on July 28th, 1923. This is in an editorial called Jewish Caste System. "Slowly, steadily, and surely, the Jews are taking control of the industries of this country and using them exclusively for the benefit of the Jews. Take the moving picture industry. It is all Jewish. The film magazines do nothing but slobber over the Hebrews, parade their pictures, and describe their enormous salaries." And I've edited out for you and spared you from the ensuing complaints about Jews controlling medicine, controlling the advertising industry, which actually wouldn't hire Jews at this time or for several decades. Even prize fighting. I tell you, the man who thinks they are not a super bunch of brainy schemers is all wrong. They are taking this country over for the benefit of themselves. They are barely 3 1/3% of the population, and yet they control nearly every big industry in the country. So if Evans was concerned about the unblendability, to coin a phrase, of American Jews, Colonel Mayfield is concerned about Jewish dominance and control of all the various areas of American life, from culture to industry to health and so on, and making a special point of noting that Jews are this insidious, almost invisible minority, or at least by demographics they should be, and yet they have somehow amassed all of this power and influence in American society. That's what he had to say. If you are a student of American history, these arguments will not be new to you, and they were not original to Colonel Mayfield's Weekly. Perhaps the biggest promoter and disseminator of those kind of ideas was none other than Henry Ford. Yes, that Henry Ford. In the newspaper that he sponsored, the Dearborn Independent, which, if you were going to visit a Ford dealership at that time, Guess what the literature in the reading room was while you were waiting to look at a Model T? It was this: The International Jew, the World's Problem. One sample headline. So, how did rabbis in Texas respond? And I want to acknowledge the work of some of my colleagues here, Brian Stone and Hollis Weiner, who have published wonderful books on Texas Jewish history that I consulted for this talk. And so we start with Rabbi George Fox in Fort Worth, who by and large took, I don't know if accommodationist would be the right descriptor, but here's what he had to say. The alleged prejudice against Jews in these organizations is exaggerated, and we can only make matters worse by consistently dwelling upon the unfortunate intrusion into the calmness of American life of racial and religious prejudice. In other words, just let's all try to calm down and live and let live. And if we make a spectacle of it, we're just exacerbating the problem and situation by talking about it. When Fox left his post in Fort Worth for another pulpit in Chicago, if I'm remembering the anecdote correctly, he was given a check to buy a new car by a member of the local Klan in Fort Worth, if you can believe that. A little bit of a different attitude was taken by Rabbi Martin Zelonka in El Paso, who took serious umbrage at the idea that he, as a Jewish American, should find his patriotism or his American identity called into account simply because he was a Jew. And here's what he wrote in an editorial. I know that my Americanism can stand the test at all times. I am an American who is a Jew by faith, and I am ashamed of this double attack on my co-religionists. In other words, don't try to tell me that I'm not a good American. I'm as good an American as anybody who also happens to be Jewish. What I really want to draw your attention to tonight is what happened just a little bit down the road from here in Galveston, where a very fruitful Jewish-Catholic alliance between two men, Rabbi Henry Cohen, perhaps the most famous and well-known rabbi in Texas history, and Father James Kerwin took root. Recognizing a common enemy in the Klan, Cohen and Kerwin set about doing all they could to stop the Galveston Klan in their tracks, and it's exactly what they did. They spoke out in public against the Klan and its doctrines. They worked with local politicians to deny parade permits to the Klan. If you can't march in those, hoods and robes, then you lose influence. They worked to get that movie, Birth of a Nation, pulled from the local movie theater. That took some guts. They did it. And as a result of their partnership and activism, the Klan chapter in Galveston never really gained a foothold. Following electoral defeats in 1924 and 1926, the Texas Klan fell apart. And I think it's so instructive for us tonight to see how, by working, I almost said across the aisle, but maybe across the pew would be the better analogy here. Jews and Catholics found success in limiting the influence of the Klan. It's also worth noting, however, that rather than taking on the Klan's racism directly, rather than criticizing what the Klan was saying and doing to African Americans, they primarily focused on the Klan as a threat to their religious freedom as Jews and Catholics, and their standing as white Americans of the Jewish faith. All right. In the second half of my remarks tonight, we're going to do something a little bit different and focus on a topic that's very important to me, and that is Jewish life outside of Houston in the smaller towns that you find across South Texas. And I'm going to be speaking tonight about a Jewish community that no longer exists, but that flourished for many decades in a town called Wharton, not so far from here, about 60 miles. So, and here you can see the historical marker for Shereth Israel Synagogue. The first Jewish presence in Wharton, we think, begins as early as the 1850s. These are Jewish immigrants who came from Central and Eastern Europe. By 1899, so some decades later, there were enough of them to form a regular prayer quorum. In traditional Judaism, you need at least 10 Jewish men in order to have a public service. And they established a congregation called Shareth Israel, or Remnant of Israel in English. It was chartered in 1913, and then they had their first building erected in 1921. Jews in Wharton, like many Jews across Texas at this time, primarily made their living in the retail sector, operating dry goods stores, clothing stores, jewelry stores, and many of them had worked their way up, beginning as itinerant peddlers and then finding opportunity in a given town, setting up a brick-and-mortar store there. If you go to Wharton today, I shouldn't say today because I wasn't there this morning, but at least as of recently, if you go to the central square in Wharton and you just walk around, you'll see, if you think to look down, these tile mosaics which testify to the presence, not so long ago, of Jewish-owned stores in Wharton's town square. You see here Joe Schwartz, who was one of the early Jewish pioneers in Wharton, and Saul's. This is one of the ways in which Jewish history in a small Texas town kind of secretly lives on, but you have to know what to look for. So as we mentioned, Congregation Shareth Israel was really sort of the hub and the lifeblood of Jewish Wharton, but it also drew Jews from surrounding towns as well, from Bay City and El Campo, from Edna and Palacios, towns within a radius of a few dozen miles that didn't really have a house of worship. Bay City did have a Jewish house of worship, but that came much later. And these are archival materials that we have in the Joan and Stanford Alexander South Texas Jewish Archives here at Rice about the history of this community. This is one of my favorite things to show off. So the major annual event in Wharton's Jewish community was the barbecue, the famous Shareth Israel barbecue, and we have in the collection in the library this T-shirt which says, "I survived the Shareth Israel barbecue," Wharton, Texas. And it was an event that often would bring people back to Wharton who'd left, who'd moved away, who'd graduated high school and gone off to college, and but this would bring them back. And so it was a very joyous event. It was a fundraiser. It was an interfaith event. Everybody would come out for chicken, and really kind of a lovely moment that says a lot about Texas small towns being hospitable and welcoming. But at the same time, there were also aspects of life in Wharton that were not so hospitable and welcoming for Jews. I'm sure some of you in this room know Larry Waldler personally. I spoke with Larry in October of 2020, so back in just a few months after we had adjusted to pandemic life. I spoke with Larry about his experiences growing up in Wharton. Larry is not only a wonderful human being and a retired attorney, he was the last Jewish person in Wharton. And with his departure from the town, there are no Jews left living in Wharton anymore. So I'm going to play you the first of two clips tonight from my conversation with Larry about what it was like to grow up Jewish in a place like Wharton.
17. So you were the last Jew.
Yeah. They told me to turn out the light when I left.
Yeah. We'll come back to that, but I want to focus a little bit more on maybe your family life and maybe your childhood. Tell us about what it was like to grow up as a Jewish child in Wharton.
There was a very active Jewish community. There was Sunday school. There was Jewish education at the synagogue. I was in the, I think, 7th grade before I had heard any anti-Semitic remark about, "Hey, Jew boy, what's, you going to school here now?" Something like that. That was the first time I heard anything like that. I know as a young child, I went to a couple of, we didn't have all kindergartens were private at that time. And I went to 2 private kindergartens. I participated in programs, including Christmas programs. I remember my aunts would come and to the program, and it was just the Jewish community was just recognized. The synagogue was about 2 blocks from the courthouse. At that time, I remember newspaper ads on the high holidays as to which clothing stores, groceries, hardware stores, and other Jewish merchants would be closed, what days they would be closed, what days they would be open. The square pretty much closed down for the high holidays, Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. They were most of the merchants around the square.
Because most of the stores were owned by Jewish families, so it was like a ghost town on Rosh Hashanah.
Couldn't buy a suit in Wharton, Texas on the high holidays. That's kind of crazy, but that's the way it was. All right. Let's apply for membership at the Wharton Country Club, shall we? Here are the bylaws from the Wharton Country Club. This is from February of 1949. I should hasten to add that this is not true anymore about the Wharton Country Club, in case members of the club should be watching this recording. Article 3, Section 1. Active membership shall be open to any resident of Wharton County over 21 years of age, of good moral character, acceptable to the board of directors. Okay. All right. Article 5, Sections 1 and 2. Each applicant shall be proposed and recommended by at least 2 active members. The names, residences, and occupations of the applicants proposed for membership, with the names of the members proposing and recommending them, shall be posted upon the bulletin board of the club at least 2 weeks before being acted upon by the board of directors. What's wrong with that? Well, seems harmless. It seems innocuous. There's no smoking gun in that kind of language. And yet, what it implies is that membership to the club is predicated on somebody, more than one somebody, deciding that you are of good moral character and acceptable to the board of directors, whatever acceptable means in this case. And you have to have 2 current members be willing to vouch for you, and not just willing to vouch for you, but be willing to put their names next to your application, which includes not only your name and where you live, but how you make a living, which in Wharton, Texas in 1949 is a way of screening for Jews, right? It is. So we have in the South Texas Jewish Archives the following correspondence from a man named Edward Littman to the Wharton Country Club Board of Directors, dated December of 1953. And here's an excerpt of what Mr. Littman wrote. I'm referring to my recent conversation with Mr. Lloyd G. Russ, Jr., a member of your board of directors, with whom I discussed the question of non-membership of Jewish residents of Wharton in your club. When I first came to Wharton last year, I was not only surprised but stunned to find this condition existing here, particularly since I left Germany for racial reasons and fought the war as an American enlisted man and officer for 4 years to eliminate persecution and prejudice. And Littman goes on in the letter to accuse the club of intentionally screening out Jewish candidates and demands that they take action and meet and do something about it. And we have the response from the club. Dear Mr. Littman, thank you for your letter of December 23rd regarding the question of non-membership of Jewish residents of Wharton in the Wharton Country Club. The present board of directors has expressed a desire to do something about this problem several times, but we did not know how to start. Your letter has done this, and we are grateful to you for writing it. The board met December 23rd, 1953, and your letter was read and considered, and the board authorized me to write this letter. Membership in the Wharton Country Club is open to any resident of Wharton County over 21 years of age, of good moral character, acceptable to the board of directors, who apply and are sponsored by 2 members of the club. No person of Jewish faith has ever been turned down or refused membership by the board of directors, and no one of Jewish faith or blood will be turned down or refused membership in the Wharton Country Club by this board of directors simply for the reason that they are Jewish. A copy of the bylaws of the Wharton Country Club are enclosed for your information. The board of directors will be happy to accept application for membership in the Wharton Country Club from residents of Wharton County of Jewish faith or blood, and will consider and act on them in exactly the same manner as applications for membership by residents of non-Jewish faith. Sincerely yours, Board of Directors of Wharton Country Club. That's interesting. Because in the first paragraph of this letter, what does the writer do? He says, we know it's a problem. We've thought about doing something about it. You just wrote us a letter, and now we're going to do something about it. Okay. But then, at the end of the letter, what does he say? No person of Jewish faith has ever been turned down. But if that's true, then how do you know this is a problem that you've now resolved to maybe start thinking to do something about? Right? So it doesn't make sense. So I asked Larry Wadler about this. Here's what he had to say.
1945, Wharton had developed a country club. And so I was 9 years old. But I knew it was developed, and I knew that my father told me that a friend of his had come to him and said, Paul, there's a country club forming, but they've decided they don't want any of the Jews to belong because they think there are enough of them that if they all belong, they would run the club, and they don't want that to happen. So the Jews were not invited to join the country club that formed in 45. But later on, it was in 1964 that I was asked if I would join the country club because they were enlarging it and looking for new members and younger members. And I called the Houston Anti-Defamation League and said, what do you think? And they said, well, do you want to join the club? If they've invited you, join the club. So we did. And some of the older members of Wharton who were intentionally not invited into the club when it was formed never joined the club. A couple of them did later on in life, but some of them just refused to participate.
So this story of the Wharton Country Club, right, it might seem at first like an insignificant incident, right? I mean, being able to join a country club or not, ultimately, what's important about that? Well, I actually would argue that it fits a much larger pattern of American anti-Semitism that really peaked in the middle decades of the 20th century. And you see it in exclusion from other kinds of so-called elite sectors of American life, from neighborhoods like River Oaks, which famously did not allow Jews to buy homes in that neighborhood for some time. Educational institutions, which sometimes barred Jews from attending. And you can see here, this is interesting. I did a keyword search in the Houston Chronicle records for Gentiles only. I didn't find a lot, but I found this real estate notice in the classified section, Bel Air, and it says 5115 Peach Street, which I'm not sure where 5115 Peach is, if there is even a 51, or maybe that's, I don't even know. Anyway, it says, new upper modern 4 rooms kitchenette, Gentiles only, reasonable. And the reasonable there is, of course, referring to the price, but that comment hasn't aged well. Right? Jews also faced exclusion from certain occupational opportunities. Later on in the interview that I did with Larry Wadler, he talks about being at the University of Texas Law School at a time when many law firms would not hire Jews, would not hire Jewish students, even Jewish students with exceptional grades. Other firms, such as advertising firms, engineering firms, would not hire Jews at this time. So it's not just Wharton and it's not just at the country club, but it's symptomatic of a much bigger problem. There is kind of a bittersweet coda to the story of Sherith Israel and the Wharton Jewish community. And it's one that's very central to our work at Rice, and one that unfortunately is a pattern that we see being replicated across not only South Texas, but ultimately the entire country. And that is the gradual but steady disappearance of small-town Jewish life in the United States. By the spring of 2002, there were barely enough Jewish residents left in Wharton and the surrounding towns to support a regular prayer quorum. And so, sadly, the members of the congregation decided to hold a final service on April 27th, 2002, which you can see photos of here on the screen. And after that, the building was vacated. And then, tragically, although nobody was physically harmed, the building that had once housed Sherith Israel burned to the ground in 2010 in an act of arson. It's not clear to me if it was intentional or not. But if you go to Wharton today, and I hope you will, there's very little physical remnant left of what was once, for decades, a thriving Jewish community. But the memory of Jewish life in Wharton lives on. It lives on in various ways. We have 6 boxes of documents, photos, artifacts, and other records in the Woodson Research Center at Rice, some of which you've been able to see tonight and listen to, including our oral history work. The Institute for Southern Jewish Life, another wonderful organization based in Jackson, Mississippi, has also done oral histories with Jewish Whartonians? Whartonians? Sure. Why not? And this is really touching to me, and I saw this, I was last in Wharton a few years ago, and there was a community mural in the town, and it documented all of the houses of worship that had been central to Wharton across its history, and here is a painting of the original synagogue building, which I think is just really nice. So, that's a lot of anti-Semitism for one evening. And I know we're all really looking forward to the reception in a few minutes, and I know I am. But I want to close by just reflecting for a minute on some of the patterns and themes that we've seen in this examination of anti-Semitism in Texas history tonight. So the first would be this idea of the Jewish person as being somehow unalterably un-American, and therefore a threat to the American way of life, whatever the American way of life is or means. And if the Jewish person is unalterably un-American, no amount of acculturation, education, or passing will work. Okay? And then next is the idea that, unfortunately, we heard chanted in the streets of Charlottesville in 2017, the slogan, "Jews will not replace us." There is a fear of ceding power and control over American institutions, whether it's the neighborhood, the university, the law firm, the country club, to Jews and other minorities. Okay? So there's a perceived power struggle that's underlying a lot of this rhetoric and activity that we've talked about tonight. And then finally, a trope of blaming Jews for all of society's ills. For rapid social change. If you go back and you read the Dearborn Independent and you read Colonel Mayfield's weekly, Jews are responsible somehow for every problem in 20th century America, from the fixing of sports matches to the proliferation of jazz music and so on and so forth. And unfortunately, right, these concepts and ideas are still with us. They have not dissipated. They have not disappeared. So what can we do? Well, I don't know. But some ideas that seem evident to me from this discussion tonight, first of all, we have to acknowledge hatred and intolerance when we see it. And we have to call it out. We should be nurturing allies and coalitions. We learned the lesson of what Father Kerwin and Rabbi Cohen were able to accomplish in Galveston, and I think that's a very powerful and instructive lesson for us. And I know that there are a lot of organizations here in Houston, from the Boniuk Institute to Interfaith Ministries and many, many others, who are deeply committed to doing this important work. And then we have to preserve history. We have to preserve history. We have to study and teach it, not because history keeps repeating itself. I think that's too simplistic. But because there are real lessons and examples that we can draw from the past in order to understand what's happening now. We should be promoting access to archives. We should not be locking up historical records under lock and key, but we should be making them available to you, to the public, to come and learn from. And then finally, we should be supporting organizations like the Boniuk Institute and the Menil, which are promoting dialogue, awareness, and community connections. And I truly believe that at this moment in our history, learning to appreciate all the cultures and religious traditions that are cherished by Americans of different backgrounds is more important than ever. Thank you very much. Okay, we have time for a single question. No, we have time for more questions.
And I have a mic here, so just raise your hand. There you go. You had indicated that one of the actions that you advocate is promoting access to these archives. Is there any effort being done nowadays to digitize a lot of this material?
Okay, great. So the question was about digitization of archives as a means of promoting ACT. That's a wonderful question. Digitization for the archivist is a wonderful tool for two reasons. Number one, preservation. Because God forbid we had a pretty bad rainstorm tonight. Thank goodness it blew through quickly. But the genesis of this work really came out of Hurricane Harvey. And so if we have digital versions of something, they can hopefully survive another natural disaster, the likes of which I hope we don't see anytime soon. But the other thing that's wonderful about digitizing materials is that it opens up all kinds of access. Let's say you can't come to Houston. Let's say you can't make it to Rice University for any number of reasons. We all just lived through a multi-year pandemic in which access to physical institutions and travel was severely limited. But if it's available digitally, then that opens up all kinds of really rich avenues for research and study. The problem is, how do you do it? Okay, and this might be a little bit too inside baseball, but you threw it, so I'm going to hit it. If you scan something, that's great. But if you've only scanned it, and nobody can get at it, then you haven't finished the job. And so I spoke about this a little bit earlier, but one of the ways that we at Rice are working to address this issue is, number one, we have our own portal for digital materials that are in our collections that you can find online and access. We actually just recently updated to a new platform called Cortex. It's real inside baseball now, which is much bigger and better and more user-friendly. But there's also a free plug for a website called the Portal to Texas History. If you go to texashistory.unt.edu, you can access half the stuff I just showed you. In your pajamas, in your living room, drinking a cup of coffee. It's amazing. And so we have partnered with them to make some of our biggest and most important collections available. Other institutions around the state have done the same. It's a one-stop shop for Texas historical research. And it's just great, and I can't recommend it enough. Thank you. Sari.
How do you work to facilitate between two minority groups that feel like they're competing instead of being cooperative, they feel like they're competing for the same piece of pie?
Okay. Yeah, that's a fantastic question without an easy answer. So the question was, all this, flowery talk about, coalition building and allyship, and a term that gets thrown around a lot today, intersectionality, right? It's all great. And of course, who would be opposed to that? Well, some people would, right? But most of us wouldn't. But then what happens, the question says, when you start to kind of get beneath the surface? And this is an issue that particularly becomes relevant when we're talking about Black-Jewish relations. And I talked earlier this evening about the Kanye West episode and the Kyrie Irving episode, and many of us are familiar with the kind of vitriol that gets spewed by the likes of Louis Farrakhan and others. And what we have to do is, speaking as an American Jew, right, from my own position, we have to recognize that rhetoric when we see it. We have to speak out against it. But we also have to be willing to confront racism in our own communities. Okay? And not, shove it under the rug or pretend that it doesn't exist. And then we have to be willing to sit down and talk. We have to be willing to sit down and talk, share our histories, learn what we've suffered in common, but also maybe how we've hurt each other, and then from there, hopefully, be able to move forward. Not easy to do. If it were easy to do, we would have done it already. But I think that's how we do it. Great question. Someone else? No? There's a reception in the other room, right? And there's also the incredible opportunity to tour the Lewen exhibit. Well, I want to thank you for coming tonight, for braving the biblical downpour that we experienced, classic Houston, and again, thank you to the Menil and to the Boniuk for sponsoring this program.